Bye enemies, I won't see you next time on another episode of Alan. My name is Generation Tech. So directly after the heist on Aldhani, we retreated to the scene of ISB headquarters in complete chaos. Major Partagaz addresses his underlings, saying the following.
I want every star sector and planetary emergency retaliation plan in the building ready for presentation by midnight.
What exactly does that mean? And why is the ISB, which is an intelligence gathering agency, pulling up these type of retaliation files? Shouldn't this be the job of the Joint Chiefs Advisory Board that talks directly to Palpatine?
Rebel Alliance is too well equipped. They're more dangerous than you realize.
Is this going to be bad? Are people going to die? Yes. And yes.
Oh, it's beautiful.
In today's episode, we're going to take a look at what planetary retaliation is, why the ISB is in charge of doing this, and what that really means for the future of this organization. But before we get to that, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Ownasaber.com. Today we have the First Dawn lightsaber. You guys might recognize this as the first lightsaber used by Obi-Wan Kenobi, which he then lost after Maul kicked it down that hole in episode 1. It's also very similar to his second lightsaber, which the Geonosians stole from him in episode 2. In all honesty, there's nothing really wrong with the design of this hilt. I think Obi-Wan was just not being careful, like Anakin was.
This weapon is your life.
You guys can see for yourself by pairing this blade with both the LGT RGB blade, which is better for dueling, or the Xenopixel blade. And for a limited time, you guys can use our promo code, which is PORG, that's all caps, to get 20% off during checkout. Check out the link down below for more information. And as usual, thank you for your patience. On to the rest of the video. So let's talk planetary retaliation. First, let's not forget that Tony Gilroy wrote Rogue One, and at the center of Rogue One was the Death Star program, which was being fought over by director Krennic and of course everyone's favorite psychopath, Wilhelm Tarkin. Tarkin came from a long line of military leaders and governors from the outer rim planet known as Uradu. The Tarkin family basically spent generations trying to tame the planet from dangerous wildlife and bandits. Here's a picture of young Wilhelm Tarkin fighting off giant alien lions with a spear, a Tarkin rite of passage. Needless to say, Tarkin had a really messed up childhood and therefore grew up seeing the world as a very dangerous and scary place. He didn't really understand that political and societal stability could be achieved through simple economic development and better living conditions. And so whenever he saw unrest or dissidence, he wanted to crush it with an iron fist. He would go on to serve in the Republic military during the Clone Wars. It was during that time that he would begin to develop the basis for his military political doctrine known as the Tarkin Doctrine. Wilhelm Tarkin recognized that the galaxy was too large of a place to control through conventional military means. And so he believed that he could make people obedient through terrifying demonstrations of military force. Remember that scene where Mon Mothma was addressing an empty Senate?
This is a boot to the throats of all Gormans, who've done nothing more than request their basic rights.
Well, in Legends, a bunch of Gorman protesters try to block his landing pad, and Tarkin decides to land on top of them. Boom! Tarkin Doctrine. He's a complete psychopath. We also see Tarkin Doctrine reflected in the Empire's military design choices like the AT-AT, the Star Destroyer, and also the helmeted Stormtrooper Legions. These were not the most practical military designs. Instead, they were really used as weapons of visual terror. Tarkin always believed that the best deterrence was scaring people into believing that resistance is futile. The thing is, Tarkin was well ahead of his curve in those early days. You see, the Empire was not a stagnant organization. It developed and grew like any political entity over the years. And in my opinion, there were actually 3 different phases of the Empire, and we honestly should do like a separate video about this. First, you have the pre-Alderaan and Yavin period, which is when the Empire is more naive and almost innocent.
Do you have any information about a Jedi?
I would know one if I saw one.
Like during the Andor series. Lieutenant Gorn, can we have off so we can see the Star Show tomorrow?
I want it painted the day after tomorrow.
The Empire at this point was relatively untested and unchallenged, and you had a huge number of decent people working within the Empire because they were simply the largest employer out there. And for the most part, you could be an Imperial and not have to do terrible things like shoot innocent civilians. There are also those who legitimately believed in the Empire's goals and missions. They most likely had seen the terrible death and destruction that poor and weak governance and economic policy could create. It shouldn't be surprising that many of the so-called good Imperials, from Ray Sloan to Iden Versio, came from worlds that used to be impoverished, dangerous, and backwards before the rise of the Empire. The next period that we have is the Galactic Civil War period, which goes from basically Yavin all the way to Endor. It's during this time period that the Empire hardens. The ISB, as we'll talk about later, takes a more direct role in military operations, and the Imperial Senate is dissolved. The Empire would more liberally begin applying collective punishment and other draconian measures to attempt to stop the rebellion from growing. Many of the good Imperials, especially the more independent-minded ones, will have defected, especially after Alderaan, if they actually knew it wasn't a mining accident. The period of time after the Battle of Endor until the Battle of Jakku is probably one of the most chaotic and destructive periods of Imperial rule. This is the third and final phase when the Empire was just in complete chaos and run by batshit crazy extremists and warlords. Imperial forces by this point in time was made up of the most fanatic and cruel and evil people that you can imagine. By this point, the ISB played a much larger role in leading military operations, a role that they fell into more and more as the war began to escalate, especially after the conventional military structure proved incapable of stamping out the insurgency. A member of Compnor, which is the political movement that supports Palpatine, the ISB would eventually become far more than just an intelligence agency. They would essentially become Palpatine's guiding hand, a hand with almost unlimited power. Now, this oftentimes happens in authoritarian governments. The top-down hierarchical nature of these organizations and the lack of transparency and rule of law usually breeds high levels of corruption and incompetency. Sure, you have shiny toys and scary large weapons, but the military leadership is full of individuals like Admiral Kendall Ozzel, who is far more skilled at political gamesmanship and shifting blame to underlings than actual military command. Meanwhile, skilled officers will be fighting for their lives on the front line without adequate leadership and support, like Maximilian Veers, or get stymied by political nonsense that was rampant throughout the High Command, as Grand Admiral Thrawn would experience. Once the military inevitably begins to collapse and fail, the dictator at the top will always have the option to take over and micromanage every military movement. This is obviously not recommended, but for some reason, the ego of dictators always convinces them that they can do this, and Palpatine would do this through his ISB network, which again is not military. This is a civilian organization that is politically aligned, meaning that individuals hired for this organization are not only competent in intelligence gathering, but they're also extremely loyal and dedicated directly to Palpatine himself. This is what separates the ISB from, say, Imperial Military Intelligence. So why does Palpatine need the ISB? Why can't he just begin to order the Imperial Military to begin brutalizing the local population as retribution for the Aldhani heist? Well, it's because not all Imperials, especially in the Imperial Army, which is less ideological, will embrace Palpatine's ideas and the New Order's ideas. The Empire is still full of normal imps, like Lieutenant Gorn, for instance, who is beginning to see cracks in his loyalty to the Empire. I mean, not even the hardy Commandant with his elitist views on the local Aldhanis is ready to slaughter people en masse from orbit with turbolasers.
But then along the way, we've placed a series of comfort units, shelters and taverns with cheap local beverages. Quite predictably, what began as 500 pilgrims at the bottom has already dwindled down to, where are we now, Lieutenant?
And that's mainly due to the culture that the Empire inherited from the Galactic Republic. The Republic had lasted for tens of thousands of years and built a society based on universal principles of individual freedom, protecting the rights of sentience paired with a moderated free market that allowed for more even distribution of resources and opportunities. People had things. They had wealth, they had professions, and because they had that, they wanted to protect what they have by creating communities. And in order to create communities, well, you kind of have to be nice to each other and show compassion and create a shared set of rules that you all agree on. Lieutenant Gorn might have been just a child during the Republic period, but he was clearly raised with the Republic's principles and morality. And most of the galaxy had such values, especially the more stable regions of the galaxy. Of course, you had crazies and psychopaths too, but generally, when humans, and I guess near humans, create more advanced social structures and civilizations, there's a huge incentive to create rules and protections against these more chaotic and evil individuals and keep them locked up. Individuals, honestly, like Chief Palpatine. But Emperor Palpatine was a Sith, and he wanted to spread his own brand of Sith ideology to counteract the Republic's ideology. But this was very much an ideology centered around fighting and competing for power at all costs, without rules or inhibition. By its nature, this mentality runs counter to creating a stable and peaceful society. The Sith mentality can only work when a small group of elites are able to oppress the masses, take all of their resources, and then finally the elite will fight over the gathered wealth. This is why the Sith Empire, or any Sith-run empire, is kind of stupid. I mean, the smartest and most successful Sith, Darth Bane, realized that he needed to kill all of the Sith and limit their numbers to just 2 at a time, because he understood just how terrible things got when you had more than a handful of Sith in a room. But still, Palpatine would try. He would try to push his Sith mentality onto the rest of the galaxy, but this was not easy to do. Because obviously people would be repulsed by the idea, and it would create probably chaos in the streets. And so Palpatine would instead insert the Sith mentality inside of the massive Imperial Academy system. The best way to control how a population thinks is by creating a massive, all-encompassing education system, one that actually wasn't just used for teaching people, but also to essentially compile data on all of your manpower and understand how to utilize it.
Data is the new oil.
Those who fit the Sith profile and were physically impressive were sent to units like the Stormtrooper Legion for their adherence to the New Order's ideology and understanding. Those who fit the Sith profile but were really intelligent, however, were sent to the ISB, and these ISB agents and supervisors would be sent to put pressure on local Imperial Navy and Army assets and make them do things that might go against even the Empire's own regulations and procedure. And if a high-ranking military officer refuses, well, the ISB will be there to brand them as a traitor. So my belief is that Major Partagaz is following the Tarkin Doctrine here, and I guess planetary retaliation plans are just researched and well thought out ways to scare the local populace into submission. We've already seen this shot in the trailer of Cinta looking up at a Star Destroyer, most likely on Aldhani. It's very likely that the ISB might make the local population into an example for what happens when a heist is carried on your world. I mean, heck, they might even take out the local Imperial Army garrison to prove a point. I mean, look at what Tarkin did to Scarif. Whatever this planetary retaliation is, it will be foreshadowing the gradual hardening of the ISB as it turns into a really extreme organization. And although we might not see the Death Star at all during Andor, there definitely is the possibility that we might see the Empire carry out what's known as Base Delta Zero. This was defined as the systematic complete destruction of all assets of production, including factories, arable land, mine fisheries, and all sentient beings and droids on a planet. The Empire would utilize the older Victory-class Star Destroyer along with the Imperial-class Star Destroyer to carry out these orbital bombardments. They were not only terrifying for the people on the ground, but they were also pretty terrifying for the people carrying out those actions. Which is why the fanatic ISB will need to be there to steady their shaking hands. It's also pretty clear that Dedra Meero, who seems like a decent individual, won't have long with such an extreme organization.